The fluorescent lights hum in the underground bunkers beneath Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. It's 8:30 a.m., August 6th, 1945, and the humid summer air carries the weight of a nation at war for nearly 4 years. Staff officers in sweat-stained khaki uniforms bend over communication boards, plotting pins on massive wall maps that show the shrinking perimeter of the Japanese Empire. General Korochika Anami, Japan's war minister, strides through the corridors with the bearing of a career soldier who has never known defeat. At 58, his weathered face carries the confidence of a man who believes absolutely in Japan's divine destiny. The morning briefing should be routine. Overnight reports from garrison commanders across the home islands, updates on the massive Ketsugo defense preparations designed to make any American invasion so costly that the enemy would sue for peace. But something is wrong. The communication board for the Chugoku military district shows nothing. No morning reports from Hiroshima's 2nd General Army Headquarters. No updates from the 400,000 civilians and military personnel in Japan's 8th largest city. The operators twist their radio dials, hearing only static where there should be the familiar crackle of field reports. "Sir," a young communications officer stammers, sweat beading on his forehead despite the underground cool. "We've lost all contact with Hiroshima. All military frequencies, all civilian radio. Everything went silent at approximately 8:15 this morning." Anami's dark eyes narrow. In 4 years of total war, entire cities don't simply vanish from the communication grid. Not cities with major military headquarters. Not cities that were, just hours ago, reporting normal defensive preparations. What force on earth could instantly silence 340,000 people? You have to understand the mindset of these 6 men who controlled Japan's fate in August 1945. They called themselves the Supreme War Council, the Big Six, and they genuinely believed they held the keys to victory even as American B-29s turned their cities to ash night after night. General Anami, Admiral Somu Toyoda, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, and Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai. 6 men, 70 million lives hanging in the balance. But here's what made them so dangerously confident. They knew secrets the Americans couldn't possibly imagine. Since 1940, Japan had been racing to build its own atomic bomb. 2 separate programs, the Army's NIGO project under Dr. Yoshio Nishina, and the Navy's FGO program under Dr. Bunsaku Arakatsu. These weren't amateur efforts. Nishina was one of the world's leading nuclear physicists, a man who had worked with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen, who understood the theoretical foundations of atomic fission better than almost anyone alive. And that knowledge had taught him something crucial. Building atomic bombs was virtually impossible. The uranium enrichment alone required industrial facilities beyond imagination. Massive electromagnetic separation plants, thousands of tons of uranium ore, electrical power consumption that would drain entire regions. Japan's leading scientists had calculated that even the mighty United States, with its untouched industrial base, could produce perhaps 1 or 2 atomic weapons at most, maybe 3, if they had started earlier than anyone suspected. So when the morning reports began filtering in, scattered, contradictory, barely believable, the military leaders dismissed them with the confidence of men who possessed superior knowledge. A small number of B-29s attacked Hiroshima with a new type bomb, read the first coherent report from a reconnaissance plane. Considerable damage observed. Admiral Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff, barely looked up from his strategic maps. Considerable damage from a few bombers. He had survived the massive B-29 raids that had already destroyed 42 major Japanese cities. Probably a concentrated incendiary attack. The Americans are getting more efficient. But as the hours passed, the reports grew stranger. Train schedules to Hiroshima had been indefinitely suspended. Military communications remained completely severed. Most unsettling of all, a weather reconnaissance plane reported seeing something unprecedented: a mushroom-shaped cloud rising nearly 40,000 feet into the sky. Then came President Truman's radio announcement, transmitted by shortwave and picked up by Japanese monitors. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima, an important Japanese army base. That bomb had more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It is an atomic bomb. The silence in the Supreme War Council meeting room was deafening. General Anami finally spoke, his voice carrying the studied calm of a career military officer. The Americans are engaged in psychological warfare. Even if they have developed some form of atomic device, the technical requirements make mass production impossible. Our own research confirms this. Toyota nodded grimly. If the Americans possessed an arsenal of such weapons, they would have used them months ago. This is clearly a desperate gambit. Perhaps their only such device. What they couldn't know was that their scientific expertise had become their greatest weakness. Their atomic research had taught them exactly how difficult the task was, but it had also blinded them to American industrial capabilities they couldn't fathom. The Manhattan Project had employed 130,000 workers across multiple states, consumed more electricity than entire nations, and represented the largest secret industrial undertaking in human history. The Japanese military leaders were making decisions based on what they knew was possible, but they were fighting an enemy that had redefined the possible itself. As August 6th turned to August 7th, as the first horrifying details began arriving from investigation teams rushing toward Hiroshima's ruins, these 6 men clung to their certainty with the desperation of drowning sailors grasping debris. They had no idea that their entire world was about to change forever. What happened next would shatter not just their military strategy, but their fundamental understanding of warfare itself. Dr. Yoshio Nishina had seen the theoretical calculations. He understood better than almost any human being alive what an atomic bomb could do in theory. But theory and reality are separated by a chasm that can only be crossed through direct experience. And on August 7th, 1945, Nishina crossed that chasm. The train journey from Tokyo to the ruins of Hiroshima took 11 hours through a landscape that seemed increasingly surreal. For miles before reaching the city, Nishina could see trees stripped of leaves, telephone poles snapped like matchsticks, and a strange, acrid smell that burned his nostrils. Then the train stopped. The tracks ahead had been twisted into impossible spirals by forces that defied comprehension. Nishina walked the final 5 miles into what had been Hiroshima. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he found. Buildings hadn't just collapsed, they had been vaporized. Human shadows were burned permanently into concrete walls, the ghostly outlines of people who had been walking to work when 8:15 a.m. became the last moment they would ever experience. The hypocenter, where the bomb had detonated 1,800 feet above ground, was a perfect circle of absolute destruction extending for miles in every direction. Most haunting of all were the survivors. Nishina, a man who had dedicated his life to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, found himself face to face with radiation sickness, a phenomenon that existed only in theoretical physics papers until that moment. Victims whose skin was literally falling off their bodies, people vomiting blood, hair falling out in clumps, the walking dead stumbling through ruins that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Nishina's hands trembled as he took measurements with his Geiger counter, the clicking growing frantic as he approached ground zero. This wasn't just an explosive device. This was the fundamental forces of the universe unleashed on a human city. everything he thought he knew about the limits of atomic weapons had been utterly, catastrophically wrong. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Supreme War Council was about to receive news that would make Hiroshima seem like a mere prelude. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, as the Big Six were finally meeting to discuss the Hiroshima reports, an aide burst into the conference room with a message that drained the color from every face present. Nagasaki has been attacked with another atomic bomb. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Admiral Toyoda's pen clattering to the mahogany table. Another bomb. Just 3 days later. In that moment, every assumption the Japanese military leadership had clung to disintegrated like paper in flames. If the Americans had 2 atomic bombs, they could have 3, or 10, or 100. The entire foundation of Japan's defensive strategy, bleed the Americans so severely during the invasion that they would negotiate, had just become meaningless. Why would America invade when they could simply erase Japanese cities from existence one by one until nothing remained but radioactive wasteland? But even faced with this apocalyptic reality, General Anami couldn't surrender his vision of honorable death over dishonored survival. Would it not be wondrous, he asked, his voice carrying an eerie poetry, for this whole nation to be destroyed like a beautiful flower? The other council members stared at him in stunned silence. Here was a man so committed to the warrior's code that he would choose national extinction over national surrender. In his mind, there was something pure, something aesthetically perfect, about Japan disappearing in atomic fire rather than bowing before foreign occupiers. But reality was about to intrude in the most devastating way possible. On August 10th, the Japanese military captured an American fighter pilot named Marcus McDilda, shot down 2 days after Hiroshima. Under interrogation, which included torture, McDilda provided information that would finally shatter the Japanese military's resistance. The problem was, McDilda knew absolutely nothing about atomic bombs. He was a conventional fighter pilot who had never been briefed on nuclear weapons. But faced with torture and desperate to survive, he told his captors what he thought they wanted to hear, embellishing every detail he could imagine. The Americans, McDilda claimed, had over 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. Tokyo would be next, followed by Kyoto, then Osaka. Every major Japanese city would be obliterated within weeks. None of this was true. In reality, the United States had exactly 0 atomic bombs remaining. The next weapon wouldn't be ready until late August, and production was painfully slow. But McDilda's desperate lies contained just enough technical-sounding detail to be believable to interrogators who were grasping for any information about this incomprehensible new weapon. When McDilda's fabricated intelligence reached the Supreme War Council, it landed like a final, crushing blow. War Minister Anami, the man who had spoken so poetically about national destruction, stood before his colleagues with the weight of absolute defeat in his voice. 1 atomic bomb, he read from the interrogation report, could destroy 6 square miles, equivalent to 2,000 B-29s each, armed with 300 conventional bombs. The Americans appear to have 100 atomic bombs. They could drop 3 per day. The next target might well be Tokyo. The room was silent, except for the sound of Admiral Suzuki's labored breathing. These men had commanded millions of soldiers, had orchestrated campaigns across the Pacific, had never known defeat. But they were facing a weapon that made their military expertise as obsolete as samurai swords in the age of machine guns. Still, incredibly, they remained deadlocked. 3 votes for surrender. 3 votes to continue fighting even against atomic annihilation. It would take an intervention unprecedented in Japanese history to break the stalemate. The human cost of America's revenge reveals the true price of turning the tide in the Pacific. Of the 80 Doolittle Raiders who launched from the Hornet that April morning, 69 survived the war, but their paths home were written in suffering and sacrifice. Jacob DeShazer, the Oregon farm boy who had promised God his service, spent the next 40 months as a Japanese prisoner of war. Tortured, starved, and beaten in solitary confinement, DeShazer kept his promise through the darkest possible circumstances. When a guard finally gave him a Bible, DeShazer experienced a transformation that would shame his captors. He forgave them. After the war, he returned to Japan, not as a conqueror, but as a Christian missionary. His story of forgiveness converted thousands of Japanese, including Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack. George Gay, rescued by a PBY Catalina after 30 hours floating in the Pacific, became living proof that individual courage could change the course of history. His eyewitness account of the Japanese carriers burning provided crucial intelligence for subsequent battles. But Gay carried deeper scars. The memory of watching his squadron mates die around him never left. "I never understood why I was the only one who came back," he said years later, "but I knew their sacrifice wasn't in vain." Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, who helped prove that the impossible was merely difficult, lived to be 103 years old. As the last surviving Doolittle Raider, Cole carried the memory of that impossible takeoff until his death in 2019. "We weren't heroes," he insisted. "We were just mad as hell about Pearl Harbor." The strategic impact of America's revenge reshaped the entire Pacific War. The Doolittle Raid, though militarily minor, forced Japan to keep fighters home for defense instead of sending them to the Pacific front. More importantly, it shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, nowhere in the Japanese Empire was safe. Midway proved even more decisive. The loss of 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and their veteran pilots broke Japan's naval supremacy forever. From June 1942 onward, Japan fought a defensive war, slowly retreating across the Pacific as American forces island hopped toward the Japanese homeland. Today, the lesson remains as relevant as ever. When facing overwhelming odds, victory belongs not to the strongest, but to those who combine intelligence, courage, and unshakable determination. The men who launched impossible bombing missions and dove alone against enemy fleets didn't just win battles. They proved that democracy, when truly threatened, fights back with a fury that tyrants can never understand. Their revenge became the foundation of American victory in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had awakened a sleeping giant. The Doolittle Raid in Midway showed the world what happened when that giant struck back.